universal ledger, a planet swimming in red ink. Imagine a ledger, not an ordinary book, but one that spans the entire globe. Its entries glowing on strains from Washington to Beijing, its totals growing by the second. This ledger records one simple, universal truth. Every single nation on Earth is in the red. The United States, the world's largest economy, carries a debt so colossal it exceeds $38 trillion, a stack of dollar bills that could reach the moon and back multiple times. The European Union, a collective of historic powers, labors under $14 trillion. Japan, an economic marvel, shoulders nearly $9 trillion. Look to the oil-rich deserts of Saudi Arabia, the export powerhouse of Germany, the manufacturing empire of China. All are bound by the same chains of obligation. This presents a riddle that unsettles the very foundation of modern finance. If everyone is a debtor, then who, in the final calculation, is the creditor? Who stands at the end of this line to collect? The answer is not a secretive cabal or an alien vault. It is a mirror. The modern world has built a financial system so interconnected, so brilliantly reflexive, that it essentially owes money to itself. But within that hall of mirrors, the reflections are distorted. The burdens and benefits are not shared equally. The light of prosperity shines on some, while others remain in the shadow of interest payments. To understand how we constructed this looking-glass world, a planet drowning in over $315 trillion of total debt, a sum so vast it makes the global economy itself look modest, we must rewind to the moment the first brick of this architecture was laid. This story doesn't begin with complex derivatives or digital currencies. It begins with the sound of cannon fire and the desperation of a king. Our stage is 17th century England, locked in the 9 Years' War against France. The crown's coffers, filled with tangible gold and silver, were draining fast. King William III needed an army, a navy, and supplies, but his tangible wealth was exhausted. In this moment of crisis, a radical idea took shape. A consortium of London merchants agreed to loan the government £1.20 million. But this was no simple loan. In return, they received not just a promise of repayment, but a perpetual right, a guaranteed stream of interest payments, funded by a new tax on ship tonnage. To manage this groundbreaking agreement, a permanent debt for the state, the lenders were incorporated as the governor and company of the Bank of England. This was the genesis of the modern state. The sovereign bond was born. For the first time, the government could leverage its future to pay for its present. It traded a slice of its future tax revenue for immediate power. The lender, in turn, no longer held a private IOU from a monarch who might die or default. They held a negotiable, tradable piece of the state itself, a financial asset backed by the full faith and credit of a nation. Debt was transformed from a royal embarrassment into a tool of imperial ambition. France, watching its rivals' newfound financial stamina, soon followed suit, though with less discipline, planting seeds for future revolution. The Dutch refined the model, creating deep liquid markets for these bonds. And across the Atlantic, a new nation, born from revolution, would embrace this tool with fervor. Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Treasury Secretary, famously argued to assume the debts of the states and the Revolutionary War, declaring, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." It was a blessing of credibility. It bound the wealthy to the success of the state. A government that could borrow reliably, could project power, build infrastructure, and wage war without the immediate constraint of hard currency. The game of empires had changed forever. No longer was wealth primarily about seizing gold mines or spice routes. Now, it was about the capacity to make promises that the world believed, and to sell those promises to fund even greater ambitions. The battlefield of the 18th and 19th centuries was increasingly financed in the bond markets of London and Amsterdam. Debt was no longer an accident of misfortune. It was the deliberate engine of destiny. We had crossed a threshold from an economy of what is to an economy of what could be, all secured by a chain of promises. The circular flow, the debt that never leaves home. Fast forward 3 centuries, the sovereign bond, once a revolutionary instrument of war, has become the fundamental particle of global finance. Its essence, however, remains the same, a promise backed by a promise. But the scale and complexity of the web woven from these promises is beyond the imagination of those 17th century merchants. Today, global debt expands at a mind-numbing pace, by roughly the equivalent of $1 trillion every 100 days. This isn't just government borrowing. It is corporations, households, and financial institutions all wearing promise upon promise in a towering, intricate skyscraper of credit. To solve our riddle, who is the creditor? We must dissect the largest single debt pile on Earth, that of the United States. Its $38 trillion national debt is often misunderstood as money owed to foreign powers. The reality is a profound lesson in financial circularity. Only about half of that staggering sum is publicly held, meaning it is owed to external investors. The other half is an internal affair, one government agency owing another, like the Social Security Trust Fund holding treasury bonds, a promise the government makes to its future self. Of the publicly held debt, the story is strikingly domestic. Roughly 2/3 is owned within the United States itself. Who are these American creditors? They are not a shadowy elite, but the very pillars of everyday financial life. The Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, is the largest single holder, buying bonds to manage the economy and create money. Pension funds, the retirement futures of teachers, municipal workers, and corporate employees, are secured by the safe returns of government debt. Mutual funds and ETFs, the portfolios of millions of everyday investors via their 401(k) and IRAs, are stuffed with treasury bonds. Insurance companies, the premiums you pay for your life or auto policy are, in part, invested in government debt to ensure these companies can meet their future obligations. Commercial banks, they hold treasuries as pristine, liquid assets to meet regulatory requirements and park reserves. This creates a closed, self-referential loop. The U.S. Treasury issues a bond. An American pension fund buys it, seeking safety for retirees. The government pays interest on that bond using tax revenue collected from, among others, those same future retirees. The interest payment flows into the pension fund, helping it meet its obligations. The debt has not left the ecosystem. It is the circulatory system. It is the financial equivalent of the water cycle, evaporating as bonds, raining down as interest, and flowing back to the source as capital and taxes. What about the foreign-held third, the roughly $9 trillion? This is where the America owes China narrative finds its footing, but the footing is narrow. Yes, Japan holds about $1 trillion, and China about $800 billion. Other major holders include the UK, Luxembourg, a hub for investment funds, and Belgium. Yet China's holding represents just over 2% of total US debt. It is a significant asset for China, but not a controlling stake in America. More importantly, this foreign holding is not a one-way street of dependence. It is a strategic choice in a system of mutual hostage-taking. China accumulates US dollars from its massive trade surplus. To prevent its own currency from appreciating too rapidly and hurting its exports, it reinvests those dollars in the deepest, most liquid market in the world, US Treasuries. America gets cheap financing for its deficits. China gets a stable store of value for its surplus and managed currency stability. It is a tense interdependent symbiosis, not simple creditor-debtor domination. This pattern of circularity repeats around the world. Japanese life insurance companies hold US debt. American money market funds hold short-term debt from European banks. European investment funds hold bonds from emerging markets. And the central banks of those emerging nations, in turn, hold US treasuries and European sovereign bonds as their foreign exchange reserves. It is a planetary game of financial musical chairs, where every player is simultaneously sitting on a chair and providing a chair for someone else. The music is the continuous flow of confidence and liquidity. The moment it stops, everyone scrambles, and the structure reveals its terrifying fragility. We have built an economy where the creditor is, in the aggregate, us. But an us, fragmented into institutions, nations, and generations, all passing the promise around the circle, believing it will never be our turn to be left holding nothing but the paper it's printed on. The high priests, central banks, and the alchemy of confidence. If the global debt system is a vast, pulsing organism, then its heart is not a stock exchange or a treasury department. It is the central bank. Institutions like the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank (ECB), and the Bank of Japan are more than regulators or bankers to the government. They are the modern high priests of finance, performing the sacred alchemy that turns promises into power and debt into a kind of secular religion. Their most potent ritual is the management and outright creation of sovereign debt. The foundational magic trick of the modern era is this: every dollar, euro, or yen in your pocket is simultaneously an asset to you and a liability to someone else. ultimately traceable back to a central bank. This is the deep secret of fiat currency. When a central bank like the Fed creates money through a policy like quantitative easing, QE, it does not simply print cash and scatter it from helicopters. It goes into the open market and buys assets, predominantly government bonds from private banks and institutions. It pays for these bonds by crediting the seller's bank reserve account with new, digitally conjured money. Think of this critically. The US government's treasury bond, its IOU, is purchased by the Fed. The Fed's newly created dollars, also an IOU, a promise of the full faith and credit of the United States, are given in exchange. One promise, the bond, is swapped for another promise. The bond, now sitting on the Fed's balance sheet as an asset, is effectively retired from the public market, while new liquid dollars are injected into the banking system. The debt hasn't vanished. It has changed form and ownership. The liability side of the public ledger has been shifted onto the central bank's books, a move that keeps interest rates low and assures the market that there will always be a buyer for government debt. This makes central banks the ultimate backstop, the lender of last resort not just to commercial banks, but increasingly to the government itself. Their power lies not in brute force, but in the psychological management of confidence. They signal through word and action: we will not let this market fail. We will ensure liquidity. We will defend the value of this debt. When Mario Draghi, then president of the ECB, said in 2012, "Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough," he wasn't announcing a specific policy. He was administering a potent dose of collective confidence. Bond yields across troubled European nations fell immediately. The promise was enough. This system functions flawlessly until the faith it depends on is shaken. Then, the high priests are forced to reveal the machinery behind the curtain, and the consequences are often brutal. The 2010 European sovereign debt crisis is the starkest example. Greece's debt, after years of deficit spending and statistical manipulation, was revealed to be unpayable under its current terms. The bond market, the collective judgment of those global institutions, lost faith. Investors demanded exorbitant interest rates to compensate for the perceived risk of default. Greece was suddenly shut out of the lifeblood of refinancing. The creditors then materialized in visible, formidable form: the Troika, the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission. Their bailout came not as a gift, but as a stern covenant of austerity. To access the funds needed to pay off the old bonds held largely by European banks, Greece was forced to accept severe tax increases, deep pension cuts, the mass privatization of state assets, and crippling reductions in public services. The prescription was economic contraction to service the debt. Society's most vulnerable bore the heaviest cost. The abstract notion of the markets had enforced a tangible, grinding reality of unemployment and despair. Here lies the dark duality of the system. In times of stability, debt is an invisible, weightless engine of growth. But in crisis, it becomes a concrete instrument of control and extraction. The IMF, while providing a firewall against total collapse, has long been criticized for imposing one-size-fits-all structural adjustment that prioritizes debt repayment over social stability, from Latin America in the 1980s to Southeast Asia in the 1990s. The central bankers and international lenders thus hold a dual mandate: to keep the perpetual motion machine of credit running smoothly and to enforce discipline when a part threatens to break the whole. They are the stewards of the global trust that allows a promise made in Washington. And as we will see, the entire modern economy is now architected around one core heretical premise: that this belief need never face a final sobering day of reckoning. The perpetual motion machine: why debt is never meant to be repaid. Here is the heretical yet fundamental truth of 21st century sovereign finance. The national debt is not a bill to be paid off. It is a permanent feature of the landscape, to be managed, serviced, and rolled over in perpetuity. When politicians speak of balancing the budget, they almost never mean erasing the debt. They mean stabilizing its growth relative to the economy. The goal is not repayment, it is sustainability. This is not a bug in the system, it is the system's core design. Contrast this with personal finance. When you take out a mortgage, you embark on a clear, decades-long journey to zero. Your amortization schedule charts a descending path from indebtedness to ownership. The principal must be repaid. Sovereign debt operates on a completely different physics. governments almost exclusively practice refinancing. When a batch of 10-year Treasury bonds matures, the U.S. Treasury doesn't raise taxes or sell assets to pay back that principal. It simply issues new bonds in what amounts to a colossal, continuous debt refinancing operation. The old creditors are paid off with money raised from new creditors. The obligation is eternally passed forward like a baton in a relay race, with no finish line. Why is this not only accepted but necessary? Because government debt has morphed from a simple loan into the foundational collateral of the global system. A U.S. Treasury bond is considered the risk-free asset. It is the ultimate safe haven, the benchmark against which all other risk is measured. This status creates a paradoxical dependency. For banks, they need treasuries to meet capital reserve requirements. These bonds are high-quality liquid assets they can instantly sell or pledge for cash. For financial markets, treasury yields are the risk-free weight that underpins every valuation model, from corporate stocks to mortgage-backed securities. The entire pricing architecture of finance rests on this bedrock. For the world as the global reserve currency, the US dollar's liquidity is maintained through the deep, always active treasury market. International trade and foreign exchange reserves are built upon it. Now, imagine the cataclysmic thought experiment. What if the US government decided to truly pay off its entire $38 trillion debt? It would have to run immense budget surpluses for decades, sucking trillions of dollars out of the economy through taxes far exceeding spending. This massive fiscal contraction would trigger a deep depression. But more fundamentally, as the debt was paid down, the stock of this risk-free collateral would vanish. Banks would scramble for alternative assets, destabilizing the financial system. The global dollar shortage would be acute, causing a deflationary spiral. Paying off the debt would destroy the very material that keeps the financial world from flying apart. The system requires the debt to exist, and even to grow in a controlled manner, to function. This is vividly illustrated by Japan, the pioneer of this perpetual motion model. Its debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds a staggering 250%, the highest in the developed world. For decades, prognosticators have warned of an imminent Japan debt crisis. Yet, it hasn't happened. Why? Because the vast majority of its debt is held domestically by its own banks, insurance companies, and the Bank of Japan. Japanese savers, with a strong cultural preference for safety, continuously recycle their savings into government bonds, keeping yields near zero. The interest payments flow right back into Japanese institutions, and eventually, to Japanese retirees. It is a closed, self-financing loop. The market is not betting on repayment. It is paying for the utility of a safe, yen-denominated asset. The debt is the ecosystem. Therefore, the real product the government is selling is not a future repayment, but liquidity and safety. Investors pay for the privilege of parking their wealth in the most secure, most easily tradable instrument available. The interest they earn is the rent for that security. The government's job is to ensure the rent remains affordable, low interest rates, and that the tenant's faith in the property's value, the credibility of the bond, never wavers. This transforms our understanding of the creditor. They are less like a traditional lender awaiting repayment and more like a subscription service subscriber. They pay an upfront sum, buy the bond for a continuous, reliable service, periodic interest payments, and the ongoing utility of a safe asset. They renew their subscription continually by rolling their maturing bonds into new ones. The system's health is not measured by the size of the debt, but by the continuity of the subscriptions. A crisis occurs not when the debt is large, but when a critical mass of subscribers tries to cancel their subscriptions all at once, refusing to roll over their bonds. That is the moment the perpetual motion machine seizes, and the true, unequal power dynamics of the system are laid bare. The inequality machine. Who really pays and who really profits? We have followed the debt from its bloody birth in war, to its metaphysical home in central bank ledgers, to its final, paradoxical role as a permanent, necessary feature of the global landscape. We have solved the initial riddle: the world owes itself. But this answer reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth. The phrase "we owe it to ourselves" is a comforting illusion of shared burden. In reality, the flows of capital generated by this vast machine of debt are not circular. They are a one-way elevator, moving wealth relentlessly upward. The system, while financially circular, is socially and economically linear, functioning as a powerful engine of inequality. The mechanism is embedded in the very nature of credit. To own debt is to have a claim on future income. To owe debt is to have a portion of your future labor pledged. In the sovereign context, this translates simply. Taxpayers broadly shoulder the burden of debt service, while the owners of financial assets, the creditors, collect the interest. Let's trace the concrete cycle. The source. The money for interest payments on government bonds comes from general tax revenue, a pool funded disproportionately by wage income, consumption taxes, and broadly based income taxes. The flow. This revenue is transferred as interest to the holders of government bonds. The destination. Who are these holders? As we've seen, they are predominantly institutions, pension funds for the already retired, or those with stable careers, mutual funds, hedge funds, insurance companies, and central banks. The ultimate beneficiaries are the asset-owning class, those with significant retirement portfolios, stock investments, and capital. The result is a silent, massive transfer from the broader, labor-based economy to the concentrated, capital-owning sector. A worker paying taxes sees a fraction of their income funneled via the Treasury to a bondholder whose wealth is passively increasing through coupon payments. The system is engineered so that the safest investment in the world, government debt, generates a risk-free yield funded by the taxed productivity of the population. This dynamic scales from nations to individuals. Globally, developing nations often borrow in dollars or euros at interest rates higher than those available to rich world governments. When the IMF or bond markets enforce austerity to ensure repayment, the cuts fall on public services, infrastructure, and social programs, hitting the poor hardest. The capital, however, flows out to international creditors. The 2008 financial crisis provided a brutal, microcosmic example. The risky mortgage debt of American homeowners was transformed into securities held by global investors. When it collapsed, homeowners lost their jobs and houses. The debtors, while the institutions that created the mess, were bailed out with newly created public debt. The creditors were made whole, exacerbating wealth inequality to historic levels. This brings us to the final, chilling layer of our paradox. If the system requires perpetual debt to function, and that perpetual debt inherently channels money from the many to the few, then indebtedness and inequality become locked in a self-reinforcing dance. More debt requires more interest payments, which requires more tax revenue or more borrowing, further enriching asset holders and increasing the concentration of wealth. That concentrated wealth, seeking safe returns, buys more government debt, providing the capital for further borrowing. The cycle feeds itself. The ultimate creditor, then, is not a nation or a bank. It is capital itself, the abstract, mobile, self-replicating power of wealth to command future claims on society's output. The face of the creditor is the pension fund manager, the sovereign wealth fund algorithm, the insurance company actuary, the ETF, and the central bank balance sheet. They are not villains. They are impersonal agents of a logic we have all bought into. A logic that equates the expansion of credit with economic health. This is why political promises to pay off the debt are not just unrealistic, but often disingenuous. The real urgent struggle is not over the debt's existence, but over its terms. Who will bear the cost of its service? Will it be through taxes on capital or taxes on labor? Through inflation that erodes the claims of creditors, or through austerity that squeezes the public sphere? These are the brutal, tangible questions that emerge when confidence wavers. The grand illusion of modern finance is that we have tamed debt, turned it from a master into a servant. We haven't. We have simply globalized its chains and financialized its rewards. The world's debts are a mirror, yes, but the reflection it shows is not of a united humanity. It is a fractured image. On one side, the vast majority whose futures are pledged, and on the other, the concentrated capital that holds the pledge. The ledger is closed, the interest is due, and the question is no longer who is the creditor, but how long can the debtors afford to keep paying rent on their own future?